Okay, this particular class is based on a book written by Alistair McGrath. He is a theologian from, well, he taught at Oxford for years and years. Now he's at King's College in London, about which I don't know anything. But I'm sure, being an English institution, it's got very high academic standards. In any case, of all living theologians, he's probably the most well-known right now. There's not a lot of them left. We had a whole bunch of them in the 20th century, but the study of theology is not something that is pursued by very many people anymore. Another person who is well known, also British, is N.T. Wright, but he's a biblical scholar, not a theologian. Anyway, Alistair McGrath recently came out with a book entitled Mere Apologetics. Now, I read one of his most famous books titled Historical Theology, where he goes through the history of all of theology. He goes through the whole history of it. When I was a student, so he must be getting up in years. And I was impressed with him then. And I read another book he wrote, Having Lunch with C.S. Lewis. He pretended he was having lunch with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis had a big impact on Alistair McGrath. Really, really liked C.S. Lewis. According to him, C.S. Lewis was the finest, what we call apologist of the 20th century. Okay, now, an apologist is a Christian author whose intent is to defend the Christian faith in a way that enables people to better understand it. Okay, there's a lot of distortions that many people have about what the Christian faith is. I can tell you that from experience, both from having talked to people and from reading certain books. So what an apologist needs to do, number one, is to be able to explain the content of the faith. But the apologist's goal is not to teach the content of the faith. The apologist's goal is to draw people in, to enable them to see that Christianity provides an enlightenment on kind of all of reality that other worldviews don't. Okay? With respect to what does it mean to be a human, why is creation the way it is, why is the world the way it is there any reason for hope? All of these things, the Christian faith addresses in some way. So if you look at the Christian faith in terms of the whole ball of wax, you know, it addresses all of these things. I mentioned in this first page some of the distortions of Christianity that have come around recently. This guy, Dan Brown, wrote a book. Well, I can't even remember the name of the book. Well, anyway, in that book, he suggested that Jesus married Mary Magdalene. That if you look at the Lord's Supper that Da Vinci painted, the figure next to Jesus is actually Mary Magdalene, not John, because you could interpret this figure as being feminine, but actually John was very young, and I think that's why Da Vinci painted him the way he did. And So he's got this theory that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had children, moved to southern France, and that their line continues to this day.
The Da Vinci Code?
The Da Vinci Code, that's it. And he claimed Christianity was invented by Constantine. Okay, that was the Roman emperor who legalized Christianity in the early 4th century AD. And shortly thereafter, they had the Council of Nicaea, where the Nicene Creed was put together, because this is still early in Christian history, and there's a lot of different points of view as to how to interpret who Jesus is, how Jesus and the Father relate, how Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and all of this. It can get complex, so there was tons of different points of view. So he calls a council at Nicaea, which is in current-day Turkey, and the bishops of the church meet there, and theologians, and they write the Nicene Creed as a way. They all come to agree that this is the best expression of what Christianity is. Okay. So the other thing is that during the 19th and 20th century, there grew up an anti-Christian movement which culminated actually in around 2006. They were called the New Atheists. They have since pretty much disappeared. But they were called the... Have any of you ever heard of Richard Dawkins? Some yes, some no. Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist, famous as an atheist. He's debated theologians. I heard him debate the Archbishop of Canterbury once. On all of these issues, and his and the New Atheists, and this movement that grew up through the 19th and 20th century, was that the only road to discovering the truth about human beings and the world we live in, and the universe as a whole, for that matter, is through the scientific method. Okay? Now, since most religions arose in the pre-scientific age, their idea is that these were attempts to explain things using mythological language or the concepts that were available to them at that time. Before the ascendancy of science. All right. But here's where these guys have a problem. Okay. Science, first of all, science isn't just dependent on observation and analysis. Science is also dependent on imagination. Let me give you an example. Okay. Years ago, everyone thought that creation and the universe itself existed for all time. It didn't have a beginning. It was always here. Okay? There was no beginning. Over time, the evidence built that, in fact, there was a beginning, okay? And as the evidence grew and grew and grew larger and larger, pretty soon it became so overwhelming that the universe had a beginning that they had to reimagine how the universe came into being. And that's when the Big Bang Theory came into existence. All right? Now, the Big Bang Theory, nobody was there to see it, right? It's the human imagination is involved in science too, because when you get all of this evidence that suggests current theories are incorrect, scientists use their imagination to try to organize the material into a new theory. Okay? So that's one thing that I think is important to understand. And the other thing is they tend to use arguments about the beginnings of Christianity that are not true. Okay. Now, what I shared with you on page 2 of the essay is the arguments relating to Jesus' resurrection. Okay, that's a very good case in point. All right. First of all, it's important to understand that nobody debated the fact that the tomb was empty, including the Roman authorities. The tomb was empty. Nobody debates it. The question is, how did it get empty? All right. Theory number 1, the disciples stole the body. Well, that theory falls apart when you consider the fact that, number 1, had they really done that, at some point somebody would have spilled the beans. I mean, let's be honest about it. Somebody would have spilled the beans eventually. Number 2, would all of these disciples have been willing to give their lives for something they knew was a lie? I don't think so. They were convinced they saw Jesus risen from the dead. All right? So that theory is debunked. The other theory is that Jesus never died. Okay? Well, when you first flog somebody, nail them to a cross, stick a spear in their side, and on top of that, the Romans were very good at knowing when someone was deceased. They wouldn't take them off the cross until they knew they were deceased. And even had he lived through that, how could he possibly, in the condition he was in, have moved that stone out of the way? Not possible. Okay? So that theory's been basically debunked as well. The other theory was the authorities stole the body. Well, the authorities would not have stolen the body because the authorities were concerned that the apostles might continue to proclaim Jesus as Lord precisely because he had predicted he would rise again from the dead. And so they posted Roman guards at the tomb to make sure nobody could get in there and steal the body. All right? So they never did it. Okay, so as N.T. Wright says, the only possible historical explanation for the resurrection of Jesus is that it happened. Okay? And that's using historical methods of study. All right? So those who don't believe it on principle. The principle being, we don't believe that there's a God, and therefore there can't be a man who rose from the dead. Okay? So they're not using historical arguments, they're just presupposing something. All right. So this belief in science as the only road to truth is called scientism because it's a faith. It's a faith because scientists who limit themselves to the study of their discipline, whether it's chemistry or astronomy or biology or whatever it is, and don't speculate about things beyond that, are doing their job. But scientists who, because they can't study things that are transcendent to the material world, decide that there is nothing transcendent to the spiritual world, are making a faith judgment. You see what I'm saying? That can't be proved any more than it can be proved that God does exist. You can't prove he doesn't exist either. Neither one can be proved. Not using science. Okay? So the discipline of apologetics simply points out some of these things because you see there's different worldviews. Today, in today's world, there's a lot of different worldviews, right? Things people believe in. Now, as we all know, the church is shrinking today. Why do you think some of the reasons are that people have either given up on the worldview that Christianity provides, and what we're going to do in this class is demonstrate how accurately Christianity describes things as they are, but why do you think people have given up on it and adopted other points of view? Anybody have an opinion on that?
They think they know it all.
Yeah?
I don't need God to tell me, but I can figure it out myself.
Right.
And I think some people, just like when you sent the missionaries to Africa, and you stopped trying to change them, but let them worship in their own way with their culture. I think our culture with the evangelist churches are still praising God,
Yeah.
but in their own way. A more modern way to their way of thinking. Like things have moved on and this is how we do it now.
Right.
And it works for them.
So what I hear you saying, Mary, is that a lot of people who used to worship in traditional ways have moved to more modern ways of worship. Yeah.
So I would say two things. I would say one, people don't like being told what to do and being given a whole host of rules as far as this is how to worship and this is what to believe. And then secondly, I would say that people see suffering in the world, even in Christian communities, and that makes them question, well, what does Christianity really do for me?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Okay, and we'll get into some of those issues when we move further along. Okay, so this is based on a Greek, apologetics is based on a Greek word meaning to make defense. C.S. Lewis was an apologist. He was not a trained theologian. Rather, he taught the literature of the Middle Ages at Oxford and Cambridge. Moreover, for most of his youth and adult years, he was an atheist. But Lewis was also a seeker. He was not content to remain in an intellectual cocoon. In other words, he didn't want to just, adopt a certain worldview and just use that as the means through which he would interpret everything around him. He thought there were questions that needed to be answered that the worldviews he was familiar with couldn't answer. Over time, he realized that atheism rendered life meaningless, and it could not address the big questions of life. Questions like, why are we here? Where did the universe come from? Was it merely a cosmic coincidence that the planets came into being perfectly suited and engineered for life to thrive? Are any of you familiar with how fine-tuned the universe is for life? Have you ever read about this? For example, if the force of gravity was different by the smallest, tiniest amount, there would not be life on Earth. If the subatomic particles were different in the smallest possible way, there would not be life on Earth. So what this is leading some scientists to conclude that the idea that the universe was designed by an intelligent designer is an argument that really should be considered. Because it's just too coincidental that all these measurements are so perfectly tuned to the emergence of life on Earth.
There was, I don't know, Newsweek or Time magazine many years ago, cover story, why most scientists believe in God.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to go through some of the questions that C.S. Lewis wanted answered when he decided that the worldview formed by atheism wasn't adequate to answer these questions. Second paragraph, but there were other questions as well. Why are humans so out of sync? It appears that we are our own worst enemies, given the wars, the cruelty, the injustice, and the suffering and hopelessness it causes. What makes human beings tick? Why are we constantly on a pursuit of happiness but never get there? And why are we so attracted to beauty, especially that of the natural world? In America, it is far more common to vacation in a beautiful park than in a dirty, crime-ridden street or city. People flock to places like Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, all of these places where you stand in awe of God's creation. And C.S. Lewis thinks that points to something in us that suggests we are not entirely at home in this world. We're looking for perfection and to behold the glory of God. There's also the matter of faith I mentioned earlier. We naturally seek meaning and purpose, and this will depend on what we trust in. And why do we believe in social groups? It is pretty clear that we don't want to live in isolation. Rather, we naturally seek to love and be loved. Physical pain is bad enough, but the spiritual pain of experiencing hate, rejection, and oppression can be even worse. Suicides are up in this country, especially among young white males. Why are these people ending their lives? And let's not forget what has become the express train back to Eden. That's the name of a book. Namely, the use of drugs to either make us feel better or to escape what has become a painful reality. It was questions such as these that Lewis began to explore in middle age. Atheism did not give him anything aside from a meaningless existence. And yet these questions seem to indicate that there is more to heaven and earth than what is dreamed of in our philosophy. That's a quote from Shakespeare. While it may seem safe and secure to escape into an intellectual cocoon, such that these questions either receive an inadequate answer or no answer at all, Lewis was not content to stick his head in the sand so as to be blind to the nagging questions that face all human beings. He wanted to find an answer, something that would put all of this into perspective in a way that satisfied, if not proved, its truth through reason. The success of science has demonstrated that there is a correspondence between the laws of nature and the human mind's capacity to logically figure it out. Why is that? Why do the laws of nature behave in ways that we can understand? Why does the human mind correspond to nature's way of operating? That was one of his questions. Does it have something to do with being created in the image of God? Lewis lived, the next question is, Lewis lived during an era when these kinds of questions were extremely important. They are not as important in today's day and age as they were then. But the point he eventually came to is that in order to answer these questions, you're going to have to come to terms with the idea that there's more to reality than what we see with our eyes. There is something transcendent. There is something beyond our ability to understand that has, nevertheless, involved itself, himself, herself, whatever you want to call it at this point, in our lives. This transcendent reality has involved itself in our lives and is shaping where human history is going. Okay, there's a goal to it. Okay. Now, you can't prove that there's a transcendent reality through science or anything else. But he points out, if you look at the second to the last paragraph, for example, can we prove that one set of values is superior to another? Where's the proof that democracy is the best form of government? Is there proof of that? Personally, I think there's enough evidence to believe that it is, but this is not proof. The point is, logical positivism, which was the philosophy that you could find truth only through science, was abandoned because its assumptions can't themselves be proved. In other words, if you can find truth only through science, then the statement, logical positivism is true, can't be true, because you can't come to that conclusion through science. Did you follow me? Yeah? Okay. You can't prove logical positivism with science. You can prove a lot of other things, but you can't prove that philosophy. So eventually it was abandoned. Okay, so one of the assumptions of the postmodern era is that cultural values are relative. Okay, you can't say that one culture is better than another. I mean, how could you say that? How could you prove that? It's unprovable. It's a matter of judgment. People decide which culture they prefer, over and against another one. All right? So it's an act of faith. I believe in this set of values, this set of cultural ideas, this way of doing things. That's an act of faith. It's not something that you come to by proving anything. All right? But the problem with saying that all cultural values are relative is that that is a self-contradictory statement, because if all cultural values are, if you say all cultural values are relative, you're saying that the statement, all cultural values are relative, is also relative. But it's a self-contradictory statement, okay? So what does Lewis do when he discovers that he has found no kind of overall way of understanding reality that answers all of these questions he has? Okay? He's converted. And the reason he's converted is because he was reluctantly converted, he says. But he says, I came to the conclusion that Christianity is true because it can answer all those questions in a way that makes sense. Not in a way that you can prove, but in a way that makes sense. Okay? Lewis admitted that at first he was a reluctant convert to Christianity. What did it for him was the idea that all the options for a big and little picture view of reality as we see and experience it is best explained by the Christian faith. Whether we are considering the nature and behavior of human beings. For example, what is the Christian understanding of the human condition? Just in a word, human beings are what?
Flawed.
Flawed. Fallen from grace. Right? Okay? And Lewis thinks, reasonably, that the reason we act in ways that are not morally helpful is because of the fact that we are flawed and separated from God. Okay, if a creature is created for fellowship with his or her God and with one another in a bond of love, then you would expect a completely different world, right? That's the world we look for, we hope for, the world we've been promised. But the world we're in is not that world. The world we're in is a world where there's wars, cruelty, oppression, and suffering. Why is that? Because the world is fallen and separated from its Creator. That's the Christian view. Okay, that's the big picture Christian view that Lewis thinks makes sense of why the world is the way it is. Okay? So what he's getting at is that the Christian understanding of why things are the way they are, to him, makes more sense than any other proposed understanding of why things are the way they are. He even thinks, like I mentioned earlier, that our love of beauty is an inner longing to be in the presence of the glory of God. Yeah. Have you ever been in a place where the natural beauty you were beholding was so overwhelming that you could hardly take it in? Yeah, many times? Yeah.
Norway.
Yeah.
Norway.
Yeah. Why is it that we are so attracted to that? Because we are. Yeah. Could it be because deep inside we're looking for home? See what I'm saying? Okay. Okay, so from the point of view of beauty, that's, I think, the explanation that the Christian worldview would offer. Lewis made the comment that I'm a Christian because, for the same reason that the sun comes up from the east. And what he meant by that was, when the sun comes up, what happens? What can we do that we couldn't do when the sun was down? See. For Lewis, Christianity enabled him to see why the world was the way it is. It enlightened his ability to understand why human beings are flawed and what it's going to take to heal us and bring us back into a state of what we were intended to be by God in the first place. I'm going to quote this particular verse on Sunday because it relates to Jesus as the Good Shepherd. It's Good Shepherd Sunday. What did Jesus tell his disciples when he told his disciples that others would know they were his disciples? How would others know that? By their love for one another. Okay? Do human beings have an inner desire to be loved and to love? I think so. I think that's pretty obvious. Okay? So the correspondence between the Christian understanding of what it means to be human and our own experience of ourselves is uncanny. It fits. Okay? That's his point. There are three ways of knowing things. Okay? The first way of knowing things is through science. All right? And the example I used here was Copernicus. The picture of the universe that people had before Copernicus was that the Earth was at the center and the planets and the sun revolved around the Earth. Now, you can't really blame people for believing that because when you're standing here, it looks like everything's going around us. Right?
Yeah.
That's the way it looks. Okay. The problem is that the motion of the planets didn't correspond with that model of the universe. When the telescope was invented and they could start watching the motion of the planets, they could see that model of the universe has got to be incorrect. So Copernicus suggested, no, the sun is at the center, the planets are going around the sun. All right? Now, all of a sudden, the motion of the planets made sense. It all worked. It fit. Okay? That's what science does. It observes, and then it puts together a theory that makes sense of what it observes. Okay? The other way of knowing the truth is logic. And I used a simple syllogism here. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay, is there any doubt based on that argument that Socrates is mortal? If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. All right? That's logical truth. That's how you come to truth, through logic. And we all use logic. You know, when you got a problem in your house, for example, you sometimes will try to logically figure out, well, how did this happen? And you know, sometimes you can do it, and sometimes you need a professional to come out and tell you. Okay, so that's another way of knowing. The third way of knowing is both intuition and imagination. It includes them both. Oftentimes, great teachers will use stories to convey truths that are not accessible to science or pure reason. Now, without reading it, let me just share it with you. Jesus used stories to tell the truth, parables. That's the way he did it. All right. One day, a guy asked him, what is the greatest commandment? He said, to love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. And then the guy said, who is my neighbor? And Jesus answered by telling him the parable of the Good Samaritan. All right? Now, here's the way the story is constructed. A guy is attacked by bandits, left by the side of the road, beat up and bleeding, and he can't help himself. First, a priest walks by, goes to the other side of the road, and passes. Then a Levite, who is one of the people that leads the ancient Israelites in worship, goes to the other side and passes. Now bear in mind that Samaritans were not considered real Jews, real people of God. That God had rejected them. Okay? Then Jesus says, a Samaritan came along, and he went to the man, bound up his wounds, put him on his donkey, took him to the innkeeper, paid the fare, and said, if you have to do anything else for the man, let me know, I'll pay for it. And then he said to the guy who asked who is my neighbor, who is the neighbor? And the guy said, well, I suppose the guy who helped you. He didn't really want to say that, but he did, because he didn't like Samaritan. Okay, is Jesus telling a story that conveys a truth about human life?
Always. Yes.
What's the truth?
Good and bad. Love your neighbor as yourself.
He's demonstrating, he's telling a story of what genuine human love looks like. Inspired by divine love, but what genuine love looks like. Okay, does he get to that through the scientific method? No. Is it logically concluded? No. But we know it's true. And how do we know it's true? How do you know that the Samaritan was the one who was the real neighbor for that guy? How do you know that? What if somebody came along and said, no, I think the priest and the Levite were the real neighbors? What would your argument be?
That's what the Bible says.
Okay, but they didn't have the Bible when Jesus told the story.
Well, it strikes you in your heart, right?
It does. It does. Your heart, where your imagination and your intuition is. We know what love looks like. Because we're human.
Right.
Huh?
We know what the right thing looks like.
That's right.
The right thing.
Yes, yes. And that's because, according to the Christian faith, that's because we were created in the image of God. I would be willing to bet you that most people who commit crimes know they are doing something wrong. I think they know it, but they do it anyway for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to try to analyze it, but I'd be willing to bet you that most of you know this is wrong.
I think there probably are some that don't.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible.
Experience love
Yeah.
for the right thing. So,
Yeah.
but mostly, yes.
Yeah. It's possible that their conscience never had a chance to develop.
Mhm.
Yeah, that is possible. Yeah. But the parable of the Good Samaritan, nevertheless, as it stands, we recognize in it a truth about human life. And that is that we were created to be good neighbors. Okay, and there again, that's what C.S. Lewis means by the Christian faith enlightens life as we experience and know it. It corresponds to it. Okay? And that's what an apologist does. You see, what an apologist does is engage other worldviews with the Christian worldview. And not try to coerce, force, or in any way make people change, but to offer them the opportunity to see the world through the eyes of a different way of understanding the world. And sometimes it changes their lives. Okay, so next week what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at why people routinely violate what they know is right. Okay? All right. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.